I do not understand my own actions. I don't do what I want, but instead I do the very thing that I hate. We heard these striking words from the Apostle Paul just a few moments ago in his letter to the Romans. And I have to say, Paul sounds kind of like a defeated man. It sounds as if he's speaking to a faith that's futile. And I think we've all felt this way, like Paul at times. I think we've all felt that faith and obedience to the ways of God is just too difficult to grasp. But is faith futile? So what I want to do today is to find hope and purpose when faith and obedience seem to be futile. But before I get to that, I want to talk about a video that I watched this past week. You see, I like to watch YouTube videos about faith and religion. Shocker, I know. But one video caught my attention. The title of the video is what really caught my attention. And the title of this YouTube video was The Rise of Atheist Churches. The Rise of Atheist Churches. Now that's a video title that I had to look into. Because if you're like me, you're thinking, why would an atheist want to attend a church? But if you think about it, it makes sense. Atheists, those who don't believe in any kind of deity, not unlike you and me, have a human need for connectedness and fellowship, and even a need to find ways to do good in the world. Now, the word that is often used in these atheist contexts is humanism or humanitarianism. And to put a helpful definition on that, a humanist is someone who doesn't believe in God, but instead focuses on humanity as the center for meaning and responsibility in life. To be a humanist means to embody a philosophy of life that doesn't acknowledge a belief in God and instead looks to the human for full accountability and for the conditions of life. And so to be a humanist or to be an atheist, it doesn't mean that you're a bad person. I think that sometimes being an atheist, being godless, gets a really bad rep, as if being godless means that you lack any kind of love, any kind of compassion. But being a humanist or being an atheist doesn't mean that you lack love and compassion. It simply means that you seek meaning and purpose in humanity rather than in a deity. And it also means that you likely want to contribute to society and to the world in positive ways. Many atheists who have begun in the past decade to gather, like we do on Sundays, they want to find ways to show love and compassion. They want to find ways to make sense of how it means to live in community. They want to find ways to help people in need. Their ethic is much like that of a Christian. So I gave this concept some thought. And I asked myself if I thought I could be a humanist. Could my belief system exist without God? Could my values exist without a belief in God? And at times, I think I could be a humanist. I believe that I could simply be committed to doing good in the world and to loving others without belief in a deity. I believe that I could be a humanist or a humanitarian in that way. To have a belief in God often takes a pretty big intellectual leap, and religion, admittedly, can come with a lot of baggage. But then, I had to stop and pause, and I had to ask myself, so why do I believe in God? Why do I believe in some divine deity that is beyond this existence? Why do I feel that I need to believe in God? And the answer that I came up with is this: I believe in God because I believe in a need of forgiveness. I think the problem with being a humanist is me, the human. Like I said, I think that I could be a humanist and that I could be committed to a life of moral living, that I could be committed to a life full of love and compassion, that I could be committed to living in unselfish ways. But what stands out to me is my own inability to be consistent at living that kind of life. I'm inconsistent even within my own family to be as patient and loving and forgiving as I ought to be. And if I consistently fail at being good and compassionate and patient with my own family, then I find within my own inability and failings a need to be forgiven. I find a need to be accepted despite my flaws. And if I was a humanist, my need of forgiveness could only be met in other flawed people who may or may not be willing and able to forgive me. So my dilemma as a child of God, or even as a humanist, is that I want to be committed to doing good, but I'm incapable of fully doing it. And that, my friends, is the same dilemma that the Apostle Paul speaks of in his letter to the Romans. Paul had to accept this futile dichotomy. He had to admit that he knew and understood the right, holy way of living under God's law. As he said, he delighted in that law of God. He was fully committed to it. But then Paul had to also admit that he was unable, incapable of living in those holy ways. Paul knew something about humanity that most of us still sense today. Paul knew that within himself he was captive to something not right, something that he called sin. Now, what did he mean by that? Well, I suspect that Paul meant the same thing that Martin Luther meant by the word sin. Luther defines sin as the self-centered failure to trust God. I love that definition of sin. The self-centered failure to trust God. So Luther and the Apostle Paul, they knew that they had this inability within them to fully trust God. And because of that, it didn't matter how committed they were to a right way of living, they knew that they couldn't be fully obedient to that right way of living. They couldn't fully be obedient to doing good, to following the laws of God. Luther spoke of this dichotomy by calling someone who puts faith in God a saint and a sinner, both at the same time, fully saint, fully sinner. But he defined saint in a different way than you or I might today. He defined saint simply as a forgiven sinner. And that is what allowed Martin Luther and the Apostle Paul to get up every day and keep moving forward. This is what allowed them to find a faith that wasn't futile. No matter what you believe, I think we can all admit that we often fail to be the people that we want to be. I fail every day to be the person that I want to be. So to me, what the gift of faith gives to us is forgiveness, absolution, a second chance. We can be accepted in spite of how many times that we failed. And I found that's what I need more than anything else, to be loved in spite of my flaws, to be accepted in spite of my flaws, to be forgiven completely in spite of my flaws. There are times when I think it would be tempting to be a humanist, to live a life of love, service, and compassion without the burden and the discipline of religion. But we, all of you and I, we believe in God. We worship God because we've become so compelled by this idea of God. We become so beautifully compelled by our need of love, grace, and forgiveness. And that, indeed, is a very holy thing. To be loved, accepted, forgiven, in spite of every mistake that we make, that is a beautiful, holy thing. It is something to cling to. It is something to value. And I believe this faith gives us a hope that is simply not possible without God. Amen.